communities. A quote that I like very much is, "Our school budget is our most important policy." And working with Jim and Michelle the past year, I know how dedicated they are and how very, very hard they are working for Wachusett. And so with that, I'd like to hand the reins over to Dr. Riley and Dr. Grisey, and I look forward to our discussion after the presentation. Jim?
Thank you very much. And so we're going to walk through a presentation tonight. I just want to thank everybody for being here. I want to acknowledge all the work Michelle Grisey, other department heads, school committee during a budget retreat process has gone through for us to get to this point. My hope is that you'll have a clear understanding of what we've gone through, what we've set for priorities for this budget. But I want to start with acknowledging a few things. The first off is I don't expect, and my guess is even when people have looked at the sheets we've handed out, that a lot of people are going to be frustrated. And I'm approaching this very much as a difficult conversation. And I say as such because my guess is at the end of the presentation, we're going to have school committee members who are frustrated by improvements that haven't been included in the budget, and they're going to want us to have made greater investments in our students. And I think there are going to be town officials who are frustrated because they would have thought that we should have made greater reductions and that we're being unrealistic in what we're asking our towns to support. And so I just want to start with acknowledging that. My hope is, though, that we're going to be able to share our decision-making process, and we're going to be able to provide data to support the decisions we've made to get to this point. And so tonight, for a quick agenda, hoping to give you an update on our district financial status, provide a recap where we ended up in FY23, provide an update of our current status in terms of FY24, talk about our FY25 budget development process, share with you our FY25 draft budget, offer some considerations and next steps that we're thinking about during this process, and then, as Member Brennan mentioned, perhaps get some feedback. And then what I'm hoping, because this is really our first presentation regarding the budget, if there are items or there are wonderings that people have and they'd like to see greater details, like how did you arrive at this number, or can you explain this line item, why it's increased, or anything like that, we would be happy to work that into future presentations, and certainly in specific town presentations moving forward. We've taken this process very seriously, and our approach typically is to come in where we truly feel we can support with data. And at this point, what I'd share about this iteration of the budget, we've done everything we can without having to make cuts to the student experience. And in this case, it's making sure we haven't had to touch people, because I think our staff, and I'll talk about this later in the presentation, our staff is very important. And in general, I feel like we're understaffed. But one of the things you'll see about this budget is we're not asking for any additional staff. And so our current financial status, last year was tough. I'm going to be honest with you, it was embarrassing when I was at our budget meeting and our presentation. Publicly, we shared that we had not completed an FY21 audit. We had not completed an FY22 audit. We had not completed our FY22 end of year report. We had not completed our FY22 E&D certification. We had cash reconciliations that went back to July 2021, and we had journal entries in our finance department that had not been entered since July 2021. All of that has been resolved. And so none of those issues exist in the district. And then in terms of this fiscal year, or our financial reporting for this fiscal year, we have completed our end of year report. We have completed our E&D certification process, and our FY23 audit is in progress and scheduled to be completed in a timely manner. Where we ended up in FY23, we spoke last time when we presented in the budget that we had grave concerns about how the FY23 budget was developed. And we had concerns about particular line items and didn't know if they had been properly funded. And one of the difficulties of some of the reporting that I shared a few minutes ago is that when you have not ended your FY22 year, you didn't know where you stood in FY23. We didn't finish our FY22 reporting last year until May. And at the end of May is when we had a true accounting of where we stood in FY23. Because of that, at the end of the year, we were fully aware, and we had put in a budget freeze back in January because we were concerned about the budget development process, but we ended up not having appropriate appropriations in benefits and insurance, where we were overspent by $851,000. Our special education out of district tuitions, which were overspent by $1,128,000. Our special education out of district transportation, which was overspent by $1,137,000. And our operations and maintenance line, which was overspent by $580,000. A lot of these things, the benefits, the special education tuitions and transportations, and I'll be honest with you, I would argue operations and maintenance were expenses that weren't out of our control, but nonetheless, they weren't properly budgeted for. These deficiencies, because we did not become aware of them until May of 2023, weren't identified, and we weren't able to budget for them this fiscal year. And so one of the things you'll see when we look at FY24, these are the line items that currently, or a couple of them aren't funded the way we would want to, and we have made those adjustments, however, in the FY25 budget. At the end of the year, to reconcile the difficulties in those line items and to make the budget whole, we had a meeting with school committee and we requested the following. We asked them to amend the operating budget by $950,000, which they voted to do. So our end of the year operating budget, the amended budget, ended up being for FY23 $110,000. Excuse me, $110,000. Oh, sorry, thank you. $110,036,000 and $38. We also adjusted our FY24 town assessments. I think we had at that time, when we had the budget presentation last year, we didn't know what our excess and deficiency and availability was, but we did say if we thought there was a way for us to offer something to put towards the budget, we would try to do so. We made that request to school committee and they approved that. And we had an overall reduction of $200,000 to the towns for the FY24 budget. And what that meant was, excuse me, our final excess and deficiency use last year was we built in $850,000 of that excess and deficiency toward the FY23 budget. We put an additional $950,000 towards the amended budget. And we also took $200,000 and put it towards the FY24 budget as a revenue source. That means that we used excess and deficiency for a total of $2 million. Currently, our FY24 status, I think it's important to start with what we had asked for yet last year and what we shared we were going to try to provide in that budget. We shared that we were going to make 8 class size adjustments per school committee policy. We don't just hire teachers. If we say we're going to hire teachers, we try to do an analysis to make sure that the numbers are what they were projected to be. And if we don't have the numbers that are projected, we didn't hire the positions. And so there were a couple of kindergarten teachers in particular that we did not hire because of that process. We did, however, and there was actually one grade level position that we didn't hire as well in Sterling. And what we ended up doing was hiring a different teacher in that school, but that was one that I in hindsight, I think we wish we had made a hiring in, to be honest. But otherwise, I guess what I would share is that we didn't just hire positions because we thought there was going to be a need. If there wasn't a true need, we did not follow through with hiring those things because we were really truly trying to keep to the class size recommendations of school committee. We said that we were going to hire an additional English language teacher to support our second language learner students. That position was hired. We said we were going to hire 2 additional counselors. We did so. We hired a director of curriculum. We said we needed to move on, and I think one of the things that we were focusing on last year in the budget process was we needed to accelerate our adoption of a new ELA curriculum. We were using Fontes and Pinnell and continue to do this year, but made it a priority to make sure we purchased a new program. We did so, and we'll be implementing that for grades K through 5 in the next fiscal year. We also committed to some facility improvements, among them, and one of the primary needs in the district is the care of some of our district buildings, in particular the Early Childhood Center. That program got new floors because of the funding that was provided through the budget. We also had put in for a generator at the ECC. That's in process. And originally we had asked for an appropriation or built in an appropriation of $100,000. The current cost for that is now $250,000. That unit, we've done the pre-work, we've had the estimate for the build-in and all of those matters. The timeline for generators was in excess and over a year. And so that's a project that's going to continue this year. And then we're going to need to appropriate another $150,000 because the cost is more than what it was expected to be. Where are we currently in this fiscal year? As I mentioned earlier, our excess and deficiency has been certified. Unlike last year, we do have the number. Currently, we were certified at $1,233,832. That's about 1.06% of our operating budget. The school system is allowed to keep up to 5% or 5.8 million of its excess and deficiency. I share that because the amount that we currently have in excess and deficiency is quite low, and not a great financial principle for a district to follow. It's effectively our cash reserves if there's an emergency. Hopefully, and obviously this isn't the year, but we're hoping that we're going to be able to build that up further. But I share that amount because it is something that we truly need to have access to in this fiscal year to make sure it's about 1% of our budget. And in any year to go over 1% in your budget, it's always going to be possible. Where we're following line items closely are operations and maintenance. Again, this was an issue in FY23 that we really didn't fully understand until the end of 2023. And then also, as I shared before, our special education tuitions that were underfunded by $1.2 million. We are optimistic that we're going to be able to balance this year's budget without having to use excess and deficiency. We're going to be doing that through grants and our revolving funds, but we'll be exhausting a lot of our revolving funds. Our circuit breaker revolving fund will be depleted by the end of the year for us to do that. I share all this really just so people have the context of FY25 and the budget development process. And I'm going to start with the fact that FY25 has brought unexpected challenges. And I think that's for the towns and that's also for the school district. And our FY25 budget forecast has been significantly impacted by a number of unexpected factors. The first is that the district is in Chapter 70 hold harmless, and that has a really large impact on our state funding, which I'm going to go on to explain. Every year, there's also greater financial responsibility that is being shifted to towns from the state. And then, as I mentioned a couple times previously, we had under-budgeted appropriations that we needed to address. We couldn't continually be running at a deficit of millions of dollars in our special education tuition line in particular. What does hold harmless mean? Well, it's due to a slight decline in our FY24 enrollment, but also a decrease in the inflation rate that the district was placed in hold harmless status for FY25. It means that the district is not eligible for an increase in Chapter 78. And effectively, hold harmless districts only receive an additional $30 per student in FY25 Chapter 78. We're one of 211 districts in Massachusetts that are in the status. And so some of the things I'm sharing with you tonight, they're impacting 2/3 of the district in the state. What does it mean in real money is in FY20, the district saw an increase of over $1 million in Chapter 70 funding. In FY21, was almost $1.5 million increase in Chapter 70 increase. FY22 is an anomaly because that was the year of COVID. And so that was the year, people remember, we didn't even know what the state numbers were going to be until July. But when we went back to FY23, district saw an increase of $2,600,000, almost $700,000 in Chapter 78. And last year, our increase in Chapter 78 was $3,415,000. This year, our increase in Chapter 78 is $202,000. I think the other factor I would want to share is the town share of the overall budget has also been impacted severely. And so part of that is the state's determination of each town's ability to pay a share of net school spending, and it continues to rise. That's the case in almost all of our towns, with the exception of, I think, Princeton, that's close to maxing out at their proportionate share, and then Sterling is very close as well. But that's only been exacerbated by the Chapter 70 status and the decrease in funding from the state. It's also had an impact on the FY24 revenue structure. And so the budget we're presenting to you tonight effectively is a 4.9 increase over last year. But the total assessment town increase is 6.1%. So even though the budget's rising by 4.9%, the impact on the towns, it's actually greater. Special education tuitions, the reasons behind some of those increases. State approved out-of-district placement rates were increased by over 14% in FY24. That wasn't an expected increase. This year, it's been approved that they can increase by 4.69% for FY25. And so, close to 19% increase over 2 years. As we mentioned before, our actual FY23 tuition expenditures weren't known until May of 2023. And both 2020, the fiscal year 23 appropriation, which we did not develop, but the one that we did develop was underfunded as a result. Some additional challenges. Our transportation contract went out to bid this year. We had one bidder. The contract that we accepted and we voted to accept, or to be honest, we didn't have another option, was 11.5% for next year. In addition, our contractual obligations and other cost of living adjustments account for an increase of approximately $3 million over FY24. These are things, and we can talk about it, but 79–80% of your budget is going to be your human capital, salaries and benefits. And contractually, we're going to have obligations that we pay with them. And though, while I would share, I feel like the district has negotiated a COLA or an increase the cost of living of 2.25 for the FY25 year for most of the contracts that we've negotiated. That's still an obviously very significant amount. And then lastly, the additional challenge is we don't have available reserves to help mitigate this crisis. And I would call this a crisis, what we're talking about tonight. And that means that we don't have a sufficient amount in ED, I feel like, to offer as a revenue source. And we also don't have requisite funds in our revolving accounts to offer as a revenue source. The process we initially went through for the FY25 budget, we held over 20 school and departmental budget meetings that with principals, saw their budgets, heard the work they were doing in their buildings, did the same at the departmental level. We then took those requests, provided them to school committee at our budget retreat, talked about what the priorities of the school committee were, talked about how it related to our strategic plan. And then we went about forecasting the FY25 budget based on FY24 expenditures, and some other additional needs that were identified in the strategic plan. We originally planned to look at a few things. We were hoping to fund more school and departmental requests. We were hoping to make improvements to our technology infrastructure, including things like upgraded teacher laptops to support our new curriculum products. We were hoping to make additional class size adjustments, of which we have about 5. We were hoping to add additional counseling staff, so we're still not at a ratio of 1 per school, which we would like to be and feel like we need to be, or excuse me, it's I think two at each school. But we weren't able to do that. And we were hoping to make some more facility improvements. One of the things I think I was hoping to talk to people about tonight was the high school. The high school is over 20 years old, and the work that they've done since the major refurbishment. And the high school has a bunch of major capital improvement needs. I would estimate possibly potentially up to $2 million of work. But a lot of that work isn't included in this budget because it can't be supported in the budget. So our revised budget approach, the one I'm presenting to you tonight, was to recognize these challenges. This is the situation, this is where we're at, and we're trying to be cognizant of the town impacts, but we're also trying to protect essential services. You know, we're here as stewards for the students, trying to make sure that we don't impact their educational experience in any way we can. We make it better every year, and we need to make it better. And so we started looking again and tried to pare down FY25 to really essential needs. And so we looked at the strategic plan, and we knew we could not move off the adoption and support of a new elementary ELA high quality curriculum. And so the plan is to continue to fund that. We actually start professional development for that program next week. And that was something that we saw as a non-negotiable that needed to remain in the budget and was such a focus of our strategic plan. We do have some essential work that has to happen in some of our district buildings. And so I'll go into that into further detail, but we have in particular a sound system here at the high school, which has not, doesn't work at full efficacy. And that's a serious issue when you don't have an intercom and communication issue in a major building like this. And we have to rectify that next fiscal year. We also like to finish the work that we started in terms of a generator at ECC. And then we also have a non-functioning sound system in our theater at the high school that needs to be addressed. We are hopeful if we can continue to look at further efficiencies, especially in staffing, that aren't going to impact students, that will allow us to address our class size adjustments as needed. We don't know where they exist right now, but we are going to try to do that because we feel like that's important, but we're not building the positions into the budget as we currently constitute. And then I'd also share that we're also going to look at trying to provide some additional mental health supports. The district doesn't have the appropriate amount of counselors in its schools, and we need to continue to try to find a way to fund those additional positions. Again, not putting in the budget, but if we can find any efficiencies in our staffing, that's where those decisions will go to support. So that lands us on our actual FY25 draft budget. And I'm going to turn this over to Director Griesek.
Thank you. All right, the first slide is just our enrollment update. You can see that the town of Holden has had a decrease of 37 students, Paxton a decrease of 16 students, Princeton an increase of 16 students, Rutland a decrease of 14 students, and Sterling a decrease of 23 students. So there's a slight increase in our enrollment, which caused most of that hold harmless, the hold harmless on getting additional chapter 78. When creating the town assessments, we start with first what the state has given us as the minimum local contributions for each of the towns. So Holden had an increase of 4.26 in minimum local, Paxton an increase of 2.83, Princeton an increase of 5.33, Rutland an increase of 5.36, and sterling an increase of 3.51. So you can see the minimum local is increasing 4.26 out of the gate. By appropriation, what I did, I did much of the same as what I did last year. Our first appropriation, salaries and benefits, again, was built on actual analysis of staff working in each of those, the departments, and they were updated with their the bargaining unit agreements, whatever their level increases would be, and then we set aside a salary reserve to cover unsettled bargaining, cost of living adjustments. So you can see an increase of 3.68% in salaries and stipends. For benefits and insurance, our health insurance increased by 5.3%, and our Worcester County retirement, our contribution to that increased by 9.48%. So that makes up the total increase of 5.69% in benefits and insurance. Our instructional support, the 5.09% increase, this includes that district textbook plan, which is about a $250,000 increase from last year. That has to do with the ELA curriculum for grades 5K through 5 that we programmatically have committed to that new curriculum. So that's what that is. It also includes all other instructional support, supplies and materials, along with our technology and copier leases. In operations and maintenance, we have our heating fuel actually has dipped about 14%. We were able to lock in with French River Educational Collaborative at 2.674 per gallon, and we did that last June. Natural gas and electricity has increased 14% and 12%. The other increase in those costs, and Jim will talk about that a little bit later, is an additional $500,000 for capital improvement projects at the ECC and at the high school. The pupil services, that increased 27.76%, that $18,750. The bulk of that is for something we hadn't previously budgeted for many years. We have AEDs, the automatic defibrillators, that need to be maintained every year, and it was never budgeted for. They're all over the district. So we properly budgeted for those, the maintenance of those defibrillators. So that's the biggest change in that. And then special ed tuitions. You see an increase there of 52.67%. That's one line that was not captured properly last year based on where we were at. Our total special ed tuitions are actually estimated next year to be $9.6 million. We are budgeting 3.8 of that, or almost 3.9, through the general fund. We will use the IDEA, or the 240 grant, the Fund 240 grant. We'll use $1.5 million of that grant to cover tuitions, and we will also use $4.25 million in circuit breaker reimbursement to supplement that full $9.6 million of special ed tuitions. So we're depleting like what our reimbursement is planning on being. Our other operating costs, that represents our tuition out charges for school choice and charter schools. So that comes right from the cherry sheet. Transportation, we have a pretty sizable increase there. That is due to the fact that, as Jim said earlier, an IFB was issued to renew our contract. It was actually bids were due by January 16th. We had two providers who attended the bid opening, but our incumbent provider was the only responsive and responsible bidder. So it is over an 11% increase for the first year. And much of that had to do with the 2 additional years we picked up for FY23 and 24 were pretty modest increases. And given what the economy has done, they needed to capture some of their losses from these past 2 years. So they hit us heavy in the first year. Our next 2 years are going to be 5.5% increases. So we're seeing a big hit here, but for FY26 and for FY27, we're going to see a 5.5% increase. So the special ed in district and out of district transportation, I really looked hard at what we've spent in the last 2 years and looked at that, and also that 11% increase that got handed down from a transportation to increase that. And then our last, the debt service, you know that we've had 1.4 million in debt come off the books. So that you can see reflected there as well, giving us a total overall increase in budget of a little less than 5%. The local revenues. So first of all, our Chapter 78, we spoke about that a little earlier. We have a whole $202,000 increase, which is less than 1%, or around 0.5%. Our Chapter 71 transportation reimbursement is increasing based on what we budgeted for last year. So we're looking at $2.9 million. And then our charter, that's based on how many kids we have that we're getting that come to us. So then our Medicaid reimbursement, we left steady. Interest, there's been an increase in interest rates. So we have an increase in interest. And then miscellaneous revenue, I just left the same. This brings us to your preliminary town assessments, which you do have in front of you. Holden, we're looking at an increase of 6.16%. Paxton, an increase of 5.03%. Princeton, an increase of 7.1%. And same with Rutland, an increase of 7.1%. Sterling, an increase of 5.07%.
So wanted to offer some of the things, and we have exhaustively looked at this budget from our point of view in terms of things that we could cut. We've even this morning took additional money. I had emailed the town managers last night in terms of where we stood. And from that time, we looked at our special education tuition line and actually made another adjustment as well in their facilities and maintenance. But there are a few things, I think, in particular for school committee, and we're putting out to the general public that we feel like we could consider. The district has not approved school choice in the last few years. That would have an unclear impact on our FY25 revenue, but we do have room in some of our schools, particularly at the upper levels. That is something that could be considered. I think it's important to note that we're not really positive what the true impact would be on the FY25 revenues, but it equates typically to about $5,000 per student. The other thing that we wanted to call out and just be transparent about is in this budget, Michelle had mentioned there's $500,000 for facility improvements. And specifically what that is earmarking $350,000 for Wachusett Regional High School improvements, which would include an intercom system and communication system, clocks, and it would also include a new sound system for the auditorium. And it also has $150,000 for a generator. It is possible for us not to include capital improvements for district buildings and instead go to the 5 towns and ask for appropriations. Personally, my feeling, I would say, is I would not be willing to risk that, or I would not advise school committee to risk that in terms of the high school projects. If they weren't approved and we couldn't do those projects, I do feel like we're not taking the appropriate course of action. In terms of student safety, we could try to delay the generator or see if that could be approved at town meetings. I'd say that mostly because we haven't had a generator ever at the program. Do I think the program should have a generator? Yes. But I want to be transparent about that. And that's something else we could look at. We've also looked at the possibility, and I think this would help some towns if we tried to do a single year debt exclusion for some of these items. And while it would still be something that comes out of for the taxpayers, it wouldn't hit town's own funding. It'd be a different funding mechanism to support those projects. My concern, to be completely honest, is if, again, they weren't approved, these are things that are absolutely essential that they happen next year in terms of the high school projects. We really feel at this point that any other reductions would have a direct impact on students. I'd be lying to you. This fiscal year, last fiscal year, we live month to month where we get concerned about how close our budget is. And, you can see when you actually have to access E&D, you are really budgeting down to the bone. This budget's the same way. I think we were hoping to have some breathing room because I don't think this is the right way to operate. And I think in most places, I'll give you an example. In a lot of districts, you don't access your special education circuit breaker funding in the actual year it becomes available to you. Most districts are accessing it in the second year, and it becomes something that you can plan for in terms of revenues and emergencies. We're not doing it. We're exhausting it almost every year. And partly, I would argue, what has gotten the district in this particular situation is that we were using our revolving funds. We were using E&D as a revenue source in more recent budgets. And that's put us in a more precarious situation every year. And so I just think it's it's just really important that when we can, we move away from the model that we've been using for the last few years. We didn't do that this year. We should have done it. I wish we were able to do it, but we didn't. And so just sharing the following budget calendar. We have the preliminary budget. We're doing the meeting tonight with our town officials. Thank you, and our subcommittee. Our annual budget meeting currently is scheduled for March 7th. The school committee budget approval meeting is hopefully going to happen March 7th, but we potentially we have the opportunity to schedule an additional date. Meetings with town officials will be happening during March. Our town meetings, our tentative dates for Holden is May 20th, Paxton May 6th, Princeton May 14th, Rutland May 11th, and Sterling May 6th. I was going to refer the meeting back over to Chair Brennan. One thing I would say is we certainly are open to feedback from everyone and hearing it. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, the other thing that would be helpful for us, we create presentations, hopefully in providing the information that we feel like will be helpful for people to understand how we've approached things. We are happy, though, and to provide a greater level of detail if people wanted a breakdown of, well, show us more about special education tuitions, or show us more about the history in terms of maintenance and facilities. If you have those requests, we'd be happy to take those and try to either tailor them to town-specific presentations when we come to the towns, or, in school committee's case, work it into the school committee presentations later. And so please understand, if we can give you the answers tonight, we will. Or if we can provide further clarification moving forward, we'd be happy to do so. So I just wanted to put that out to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the time and detail that you put into that presentation. I'm assuming the presentation will be posted later online for people who would like to go back and see it again in detail. At this point, I think we'd like to go around the room for questions and comments, if that's good for you guys. I'm just going to ask that before you speak, if you don't mind saying your name and your position and where you're from, so that everybody is aware. And I think we'll get started over here.
I knew I
Thank you.
sat on the wrong side. It's working. Okay. Peter Jamette, I'm chair of the advisory committee in Princeton, which is basically the finance committee. Thank you very much for the presentation. I know it was a difficult year, and even though there's an overall tone of not being thrilled compared to last year, I think we're in a much better situation. At least you've got numbers and you know what to expect. And thank you for all your efforts and communication. I think our problem really is just understanding how we're paying almost double per student what other towns are paying, and we're paying it for the same product. Basically, it's not. If we had our own school systems that we wanted to double our contribution, you would get the benefit of that. I'm not against the concept, but it's for the taxpayers, it's a little difficult. And added to that is we just did a review recently of the census figures, and over a third of our town is 60 years or older. So the percentage of people with children is going down as the enrollment is. I know that you probably can't do anything about it, but we do have a representative, I believe, here, that state senator that might be able to impact some of this. I just, I know it's beating a dead horse, but it's up to it's one of my responsibilities to do that, actually, just point it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in particular for all the town presentations, we're going to go into a further level of detail in terms of the impact on your particular assessments. And because it's always, I'll be honest with you, it's always a little bit of a surprise for us. And that was the case for me with Princeton. And you don't experience as much as a fluctuation in terms of what the minimal local is, you know, in your percentage share.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it really was those 15 students, but it's still hard to comprehend.
Mm-hmm.
And the calculations, to your point, it's just what we do through the regional agreement. But I certainly understand the frustration, and these are huge swings. The town of Rutland had a very similar experience last year.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I'm sure some of our towns that had decreases said, well, how come that didn't impact us more? But it is a frustration of the system, understood. But we will definitely, we've learned some, and to the credit of member or Chair Brennan, we had a presentation from Tracy Novak of MASC this year. And I think we have a better understanding about what the state does to help calculate that percentage share as well, in terms of what they deem towns being able to pay in terms of the minimal to what the foundation budget is. And so we'll definitely make sure we address that in the presentations.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm Linda Longoreal. I'm a member of the school committee and a member of the finance committee.
I'm Lynn Winnicka. I'm on the finance committee in Rutland. And I thank you for being so transparent. We haven't had that in the past, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate the work that has gone into this. These numbers, though, they're hard to swallow. You know, we have to educate the kids, but we have to supply essential services for the town, and it's hard to find a balance.
I totally hear you. And, you know, there's a reason why we're presenting this, and yeah, I'm worried all the way around.
So are we. Thank you.
Austin Sagano, it's town administrator from the town of Rutland. Obviously share Lynn's sentiment. We passed an override last year, which I think we were fortunate to be able to get the override, more so for the town services to restore staffing and level of services where it was needed. We left some excess levy capacity. That's completely gone, and not just from educational assessments. You know, certainly we have our contractual obligations too. When our health insurance goes up, yours does too. When our rates go up, yours does too. I'm just curious, I think, just on the budget preparation standpoint, this is my first budget cycle with you folks. I'm guessing the discretionary assessment is kind of where you fill the gap for where state aid and everything else, all of the revenue sources aren't there. The discretionary is where you kind of make the budget balance, right? So we started our budget process very early. I think we started in September, October. And I think we've had some candid discussions, Dr. Riley, and I appreciate the information you've passed along. We try to be conservative in our estimates. I think the average discretionary assessment for Rutland since FY17 has been 10 to 15%. So we budgeted approximately within that scale. 19%, I think, for all of us is a challenge. And I know that I think we're all up against it with the levy and our available revenue sources. So I'm sure everyone's going to say that. I think hopefully I'm the first. I'm wondering if there's a way, and I know that this doesn't fix this process, but if there's a way that we can, as a community and as stakeholders, dig in a little bit in the process, in this budget process a little bit earlier too. Talk about this a little bit sooner. I know you had a lot going on this year, but I think as a consensus model, I think we can work together to make sure that we're all on the same page. We can share very early on where Holden is, where Rutland is. So we're not surprised to see a 7.1% or 6.1% for Holden. I know that doesn't help this process, but it's the only feedback I have is we're getting close to start to plan for where we need to for May. And certainly when we talk about these numbers, and most of us have already presented our budgets to our select board and finance committees, this is a big hit for us. But again, I appreciate your work, and I know that this has been a challenge for you, and I don't want to dismiss that or let that go.
Yeah, I don't take it that way at all. And I hear everything that you're saying. And, one thing I'd add is the district's working hard right now. One of the reasons why we did some work, and we're doing this jointly with the towns to have an understanding of where we are in terms of projected growth. This was not expected for us. And then overall the impact from the state. And I think the state's going to get lobbied a little bit because there are so many districts that are facing this situation. I think for us, and I think we'll get a better sense, we hope that we're going to have that Central Mass Planning Commission report in terms of what is our projected growth in all of our towns. We're going to have a better sense of, is this something that we're ever going to have to be dealing with again? Or are we going to have it to deal with it intermittently? And I think that's when it's particularly painful. If there's a district that is continuing losing students, hold harmless is actually of a great benefit, to be honest with you. And I can't complain because, the state's saying we're not going to reduce your funding, but we could. And it's a very small, it's not a huge adjustment in students, but it's had a tremendous impact. I mean, and I think what I'd share is, we went from an increase of, 3.5 million to 200,000. And, I think we need to, and I hear everything you're saying, and I agree with everything what you're saying. And I think that's partly though it's so kind of hard for us and as well in this process is I don't know what we do differently other than start earlier. I would agree. But even if we do, I don't know what we do differently. And I think that's what's hard for us is we're not, I want to advocate for kids. I don't think this is a budget that advocates. And I also think it hurts the towns, and that feels lousy all the way around.
Can I just ask a follow-up on that? So I know we've talked a lot about it, especially that study. I think that's going to be great for all of us. Is the district or school committee open to maybe some innovative solutions, maybe from a budgetary standpoint? Maybe this is too radical for this discussion tonight, but where there's 13 buildings across the district, inter-district choice for buildings, sharing resources across town, things
Absolutely.
like that.
And so I would share with you that is exactly what I'm hoping comes out of this work. I feel like part of the issue when I look at the school district, that we have towns of such great differences in size. And then also, I think what we're going to see borne out in that study is such drastic differences in terms of population, where we have some communities where the community isn't growing in terms of school-age children, where we have some other communities that we're expecting a boom. It hasn't played out in Holden at all. We think it might, but we don't know. And so I think that when we have that data, that's a big part of it. And I'll be honest with you, that was a big part of us wanting to do that work. I would ideally in our smaller communities, right? What is our biggest challenge of smaller communities when we look at Princeton, when we look at Paxton, when we look at Sterling, is we want those schools to have great experiences for their kids, but we also want them to be full. We don't want to have some of our communities to have class sizes of 16 or 15, and other communities to have class sizes of 24. That's not an equitable situation. But right now, we're not employing a model that allows us to do that. And when we do that, it will make or account for more efficient use of our resources. And I do feel like that's where we need to head. And so, yeah, that's that. Honestly, if you ask me long-term visioning, what's going to have us maximize district resources and town resources, it's exactly that.
Leah Whiteman, Town of Rutland Select Board Chair. Thank you for the presentation and thank you for all the work and time and effort that's gone into it. I know, kind of to reiterate everyone else's comments, it hasn't been easy, and I appreciate that. I don't want to spend a lot of time, but a few things jump out. Our education budget is about 60% of our operating budget. I think that's not uncommon in towns of our kind of demographics. But for Rutland, a 7.1% increase is tough. We still have to fit everything under 2.5. And we, as Austin said, we just went last year to a Prop 2.5, and we're fortunate to get that. And it's really tough to swallow that now we may be looking at having to make cuts when we thought we would be good for at least a couple of years or a few years. And I think we all share that sentiment. Also, I think, or I'm hopeful that maybe we have our senator here tonight. Maybe we can try to leverage our power at the state level to show that some of the state funding formula is really hurting all of us, because it's not only Wachusett. A lot of the small and mid-sized, more rural communities, whether they're regionalized or not, are really taking the hit. And I think if we can coalesce with school district administration as well as the towns, and push some advocacy at the state level, hopefully we could see it's not going to fix this year, but going forward.
I think that's a piece that it's really important for the towns in the district to find a way to advocate. I think that's completely accurate. I think for those 211 districts, I don't want to misquote the number, but I think it's about a third of the state budget in terms of increases to 2/3 of the district. I think are sharing a third of the increases in funding, and it's messy across the state. We got to try to find a way to fix it. I think, and we didn't mention it earlier tonight. I think one of the things the district will continue to do, and we have done it more aggressively this year, and I didn't do it as part of the presentation, but I'll work it in when we present fully to school committee, is trying to access grants and other things. But I think there's a huge piece around advocacy that we need to continue to concentrate on and try to access whenever we can. We did not get a grant. We did apply for a grant for our curriculum products. We have been successful in getting some grants. Unfortunately, a lot of the grants we're getting have made an improvement in a very nice way. They've improved student opportunities. We just had one during the most recent vacation in terms of the math academies we had. But they're not benefiting our budget process, and we have to be able to target and get those grants as much as possible as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Paul Dubois, school committee member from Princeton and business and finance subcommittee member. I have one small question. When I look at the transportation costs, it looks like they are being increased at 4.93% for each of the 5 towns, which surprised me. I would have expected that to be a different percentage increase depending on the enrollments per town. And so I was just wondering if you could explain that to me.
I will check that formula.
I guess I think that's a valid point. Take a look at
Kumar Gavardan. I'm one of the school committee representatives from Rutland. All 4 of us are here tonight. I am actually going to defer my time right to State Senator. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Riley and Madam Chair. I just, Peter Durant, State Senator. I just wanted to, as Austin mentioned, this is my first budget with all of you as well, and I want to thank you for putting this presentation together. And I know it's difficult. It's a difficult year. These are conversations that take place all around the Commonwealth, as you know. In hearing the concerns that we hear, they're not uncommon. It's a difficult year for you. It's a difficult year for the state. And you know, as you know, we're going through the budget process ourselves. We're in the process right now of going through our Ways and Means hearings. The House budget will come out later. Well, I guess it's almost March now, so it'll be coming out in a couple of weeks. We'll be putting forward that budget for passing it in the House the last week of April. And of course, you've got two great reps, and Rep Ferguson and Rep Kilcoyne, who I've worked with for years and have advocated very strongly for education, especially for regional school transportation. We're hoping again in the House this year. I spoke to both Rep Ferguson and Rep Kilcoyne earlier, and they expressed the desire to try to get to that 100% that we got to the House last year. Unfortunately, the Senate last year didn't do that, and it came out about 92, I think it was somewhere in that neighborhood, which is good, but it doesn't meet the commitment of the state. Once the House, of course, goes through that, I notice all the town meetings, of course, will be before the Senate gets their budget, and that's just typically the way it goes. But we'll have a second bite at that apple in May, and we'll have a better idea as to what's happening with revenues. I think we've all seen the stories right now about the revenue shortfalls in the state. It's going to be a tough year across the board, but we're going to work hard. We're going to try to get you what we can, because this is an important issue for all of us here in the district. So I'm here for you. I want to hear your concerns. From my office, I know the reps have their folks here. I have Jared here from my office. We're always, of course, available to everybody, and we'll be talking to you if we haven't already about capital needs coming up and things that we may be able to try to help you out with as we go forward. But that's it. It's going to be a tough year, and I think we all kind of understand it. It doesn't make it any better. It doesn't make it any easier. But we're certainly here to listen to you and advocate for you as best we can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Joseph King, Sterling Finance Committee. Thanks for the presentation tonight. I found it very informative. I have one question, and that's around the hold harmless. That appears to be triggered, one of the reasons, by lower overall enrollment. And I'm not sure that we've been building up to this, and this is the year that it just occurred. I guess it was a big shock to your system to lose $3 million. It may have been expected, may not have been expected this year. And that would have made our total budget a whole lot more palatable had you had that kind of number on it. What's the likelihood that that's going to be a recurring theme here as we march forward and have to live with a much smaller overall number?
Yep, no, that's a great question. So we became aware, I think, last year, and it was actually the inverse. And so last spring, I think we were aware of developments in a couple of our towns, and we were concerned that we were going to have space issues in some of our schools and wanted to be prepared to potentially dealing with them moving forward. And so one of the things we had proposed and that work that's underway in the district is we created a task force. And so we have a committee which is looks at our population and building task force. I'm not using the right name right now, but basically we've commissioned a study to look at our population for the next 10 years. And that work is being done by the Central Mass Regional Planning Commission. We hope to have that study. I was hoping to have it actually by this presentation. We expect to have it by the end of the month. And what that's going to give us is population trends for the district in all of our towns for the next 10 years. And that's a piece that I think is essential for us to know, to your point, is this something that we're going to be dealing with in the next 10 years? Should we be planning for the need for additional buildings, or do we need to think creatively about how we make sure our buildings are at optimal capacity to provide services for kids? And so that work is underway. I'll be honest with you, when we began that work and floated, we actually started, we had the idea of bringing that group together, creating that task force last spring, but it was for the opposite reason. It was because we were concerned about population growth. But what it will do is give us a sense of trends in where each community looks to stand. That has been a joint committee where town managers or town representatives, in many cases both, have been part of that committee, and we will reconvene when we get that first phase of the study. Phase 2 and 3, which we're actually putting in for grants for, We'll have efficiencies and opportunities for towns to do partnerships themselves in areas other than education. And so we're really excited about what that's going to bring us. But that really should give us a sense in terms of what the population growth opportunities are or decline in the district are going to be. Because yes, I would say to you, that is not something that we expected. I think that is a major reason for the disruption in Chapter 70 funding. And I'd also say, the other thing I'd share to you, we didn't talk about it tonight. I think I'd probably do some of this work with school committee. The other thing the district has to acknowledge is that the number of students who are attending our high school is decreasing. And so we have students in some of our towns that will attend school through grade 8, but then they choose not to attend our high school. And some towns that's explained by an increased proportion going to the vocational schools. Some cases it's going to private schools. But we are doing work at the high school as well to look at the programming we're offering to make sure it appeals to a wide variety of students. And so one of the things that we've done is we've used some grants to increase what we call pathways. And so we're expanding our program to maybe some areas of interest that kids may have that previously they would want to attend a vocational school or have a different school experience, and having those opportunities built into our programming as well. And so that work is underway, has been led by Dr. Kroll, our deputy superintendent, and then some other folks at the high school. They've done a really nice job in that department. We're excited for what that might do for us to also try to make sure, if you look at the number of students we have in a cohort, say for grade 8, and then you look at what that cohort is when it enters grade 9, it drops off considerably, between 15 and 20%. And so we have to ask ourselves the question about, what do we maybe need to do differently to make sure we're providing an educational experience that appeals to our families and students. So that's a piece we're working on as well.
Thank you for the comprehensive answer. I appreciate it.
George Handy, Sterling Finance Committee. Just a couple of points. First of all, on Chapter 71, I had noticed that the reimbursement from the Commonwealth in fiscal 21 was 34%, and in fiscal 24, it had dropped to 25%. A commitment had been made by the state when we started all this regionalization for 100% reimbursement, and possibly having state delegates here, it might be, if it might be possible to look into that, why our Chapter 71 has been slipping as a percentage of our transportation. I don't expect it to jump up to 100%, as was originally committed, but that slide from 34 to 24, when you consider 10% of an $8 million transportation budget, that's 800,000 that the municipality is dipping into their pocket. So maybe you could look into that. Another comment I have is you are professionals at educating children, and DESE is professionals, I understand, of educating children. They control the foundation budget. They control the formulation for the minimum local contributions. When I look at a detailed line item expense that you propose, I don't know if that's good or bad. I'm not a professional like you are. It would be helpful before you came up to our town if you could put a comparison of the foundation budget 11 line items, and there's only 11, and compare those to your projected budget on those 11 line items, so that we could have a chance to see what DESE thinks we ought to spend by line item. I'm not asking you to do it by grade like they do, just by line item. It'd be too comprehensive going into grades. And then possibly we could find a way to find out why there is a difference. If they're saying X is what's required and you're saying it's Y, maybe we could come to an agreement as to understanding why. So that would be helpful if you could do that before you came and visited our town. Maybe the other towns would enjoy it too. But I think it would be helpful.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
So thank you.
Bill Caldwell, Town Administrator in Sterling. Thank you for the work you've done. Obviously, it's been a kind of a rough couple of weeks for you guys with illness and trying to put this together. So just want to say thanks. And I know Austin touched on it, a couple of folks, but you know, our job is to live within 2.5. You know, this is 80% over, or 80,000 over our 2.5 entirely. And all education is almost 200 over our entire 2.5, which is pushing us right up against an override in Sterling. And if it doesn't happen this year, which we're hoping it will not, definitely looking at it for next year. So we just want to be cognizant of that. Like somebody said, it's 50-something% of our budget, which is a big chunk. So whatever's happening on one side, the other 50% either suffers or can have its growth as well. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Understood. Thank you.
Maureen Cranston, Board of Selectmen in Sterling. Like everyone else, thank you very much for your efforts. I have great faith that you're going to continue and bring us to where we need to be so we can avoid things like the 2.5 for any of these towns or cutting our own town services, you know, fire, police, all of that, because you're like a little bit better than 50% of everything we've got. And then I would say, I'm sure Peter here is very excited that he came in person, because really what we worked with over the years with Senator Goby and Kim Ferguson was getting that transportation up to 100%, like the state had told us. And also the Chapter 78, you know, if you guys could look at that a little bit closer with the state and kind of help all of us out with that, that would be, I mean, this is kind of pitiful where we are right now, as you can see. So we can't really just leave it up to all these little rural towns and these guys working like this. You guys got to work a little harder for us as far as that goes. Thanks for coming, Peter.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I bet.
Peter Lukes, I'm the Holden Town Manager, and I want to thank Dr. Riley for all the work that he's done and the communication that we've had between the administration and the local town administrators. I know he's in a very difficult position. He's been working really incredibly hard and under a great deal of stress. In fact, when I'm in my office and I'm having a really hard day and I think I've taken all I can, I often consider calling your office to see how you're doing, thereby making myself feel much, much better. But thank you. From Holden's perspective, we're maxed out, much like Sterling, you know, much like a lot of you have said in FY25. We're right up against the wall. We're probably this close to an override. We projected what I thought was a fairly generous increase to be expected from the school district, and we weren't too far off. Where we are now is, you know, we'll probably have to make up several $100,000. And how do we make that up? We've already, with what we presented to our finance committee, we've dug into our stabilization accounts and our savings accounts probably as deep as we can. So the only place we need to cut now is town services or town purchases, and that will eat into our staffing plan and our capital plans that we've had for several years now. So that's where we're going to have to look next over the next few weeks. I think our best case scenario is probably maybe a capital exclusion this year and assume that we'll have an override next year. Worst case scenario is probably an override for this year. We have several weeks, and I'm sure a good number of meetings with our finance committee before we reach that point. But you know, we're going to have to look at removing a few of our services that we had planned, whether that means less at the library or putting off some projects at the senior center, or you know, worrying about our staffing and fire, police. It all comes down to just how tight we are this year, and it's going to be a tough one. But I'm going to defer to we have our chair of our select board here and our vice chair of our finance committee for the nitty gritty numbers, because I don't do that kind of math.
Yeah.
Stephanie Mulroy, Chair of the Holden Board of Selectmen. I also do not do those kind of nitty gritty numbers, but I do spend a lot of time with our residents, and a lot of our constituents are deeply concerned about the special education situation in the Wachusett School District. And then coming to this meeting, seeing this massive budget, and then going back to those people and trying to explain that there's this massive discrepancy where they feel like their needs are not getting met for their kids. And then we see a line item with special ed tuition where it's clearly showing that there's a lack of meeting some special needs in our community. I think for our town presentation, we would love for you to, like you said, unpack that a little bit more. It's one of the biggest concerns that I hear from our parents is meeting those needs. And then you see, like you mentioned, high school students choosing to go elsewhere. We should be, if we're spending this amount of money and we're this great of a regional district, we should be the place that kids want to stay and want to be, not be looking elsewhere. But again, thank you so much for the presentation. We know that you inherited a massive endeavor. And I think all of us here have reiterated over and over again that the transparency is phenomenal. The conservatism in the numbers is great too. I don't see a lot of wiggle room here. When you showed there was a couple of things that you could X out, they're very, very small. So it looks like you've done a great job in putting the budget together. Thank you.
Crystal Chessie, Vice Chair of the Holden Finance Committee. Pardon me. Don't want to repeat too much of what Peter and Stephanie have said, but just to give a sense, when Peter says Holden's up against it, right now, the budget before us, we're $900,000 over our levy limit at this time. $900,000 over our levy limit at this time. By the time we're done with all of our meetings, our goal, we have to at least get that number to zero. Peter has put in a sizable, generous increase for the school district and for education and all. I think one thing that's important, and I have this sense, Dr. Riley, since you've joined the district, you've really come in and shared almost much more in partnership. I think you've been open to comments from finance committees. Peter speaks highly of how open you are with conversations with him. And of course, your presentation tonight, which we're seeing, but will be repeated again in each of the towns, goes a long way. In the time that I've been on the finance committee in Holden, we've tried to be as consistent as we can be. And that echoes, for those that don't know, Stephanie and the chair of our finance committee back in December, his name's Paul Challenger, wrote a joint letter and sent a note basically saying we have taken a hard look at what our anticipated revenues look like. We've looked at it over a 5-year period. We're trying to build models that will help us project that. Jointly, it was stated that, 3.2% increase is something that we probably wouldn't even bat an eyelash at. We think we can support that wholeheartedly. But we understand that you've got to do your work, and you've done your work. Just to give people a sense, the difference between the numbers that we're seeing tonight from the school committee and the numbers that 3.2% would be for Holden, it's $1 million. So budgets are priority. It's about priorities. Ultimately, I know my role is to scrutinize Peter with the budget, to scrutinize the school district with the budget, and then make recommendations to my town body. My town body is the appropriating committee. Sometimes they want to listen to us, sometimes they don't. Interestingly enough, 20 years ago this year, I first got involved with education as a parent. And we're talking about the same things that we talked about 20 years ago. The state comes up short. We don't feel we can spend more. I'm a taxpayer. I don't want to spend more in taxes. Fundamentally, we have systemic issues here. And there has to be some way that smart people can get together
and come up with solutions that are a little bit more than living year to year. And I'd like to think that as we all feel we're getting closer to talk of override, you know, it might come to it, but I think if that's something that people feel has to happen, it should be in unison. I understand some towns have had to do it before. Rutland, you just did it last year. I think Paxton's done it in the past. You know, we know how difficult that is, right? We know. Many of us think 2.5 had its day back in 1980 when I was in high school, right? Back then, we were worried about not being able to play our sports. Now we're talking about how are we going to make sure we have teachers in a classroom. Systemic issues. We've got to figure this out. We can't do it alone. I don't think the district can do it alone. I don't think the towns can do it alone. I have no faith that the state will do anything about it. No disrespect to our local representation, but our local representation is 3 votes in a rather large group. And, you know, for all the good work that they do, in the end, they're just 3 votes. So I would just like to say and echo again, thank you very much. We have challenges before us in our communities. It's not just schools. However, I think that there isn't a person sitting here tonight who doesn't value the community that they live in, who doesn't value what the regional district is trying to do for our children. And what we're trying to advocate for is finding the right balance and convincing our town members that we are really looking at this with everybody's best interest at heart here. So thank you. Sorry if I got a little wordy, but thank you very much.
And we completely agree. We got to continue to think about what we're approaching, and part of this, and I think we need to continue to be able to demonstrate to this town. Part of this is making sure we prove to the towns that we're making a maximum use of every single dollar that you do provide to us. I do think that we're going to continue to understand and uncover some efficiencies to hopefully make improvements to the system. You know, I share with you that we need to continue to think creatively, think of options like we talked about in terms of in-district school choice and other opportunities that will benefit both our residents and also make us more financially responsible. And so thank you. I appreciate
Could I
that.
just add one thing, just to show a little bit about how we operate on the Finance Committee? We're in our budget hearings, and a member of our committee has stated 3.2% is the number, 3.2% is the number, and has sent out an email to everybody through Peter. Did he go through you, Peter, when he sent out the email? Anyway, it was basically said, please be prepared to come and provide us with a list of items that will get you from where your budget is right now to a 3.2% increase. And we had a department head come through last night. The change from where they are to 3.2 would be $10,000. They came in with $8,000. I'm pretty sure that the member of that finance committee probably going to shoot off an email saying you got to come up with another 2,000. So we try to be consistent. We know that there are times where we can't stick to the number, but it is a goal that we put out there. So everybody, the fire chief was in last night and his number was 70,000. We asked him, how are you going to do it? And he was a little shaken about it, but he says it'll be difficult, but we'll come up with a list. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Julia Pingatori from Paxton. I'm the chair of the select board. I'd like to first register a complaint. I don't know who spelled the names, but mine is spelled wrong. In all honesty, though, thank you so much for the presentation. Very informative and transparent, again, as many have echoed. I wish I could say for Paxton this year that we were in a position where we're just up against a levy limit. We are over and soared. We're off of our planet in Paxton right now. We are currently looking at for us, it's a 700,000 roughly deficit. That's after we have applied all of our free cash to our budget. and some additional revenue from our ambulance receipts. So we're in a place now where we're looking at really an override this year over $1 million. Probably, you know, if we were going to try to reduce our reliance on one-time revenues, we'd be looking at an override of really 1.5 in order to get us in a good place. So this year is our year. Unfortunately, last year was Rutland's year, and part of me is not sure whether I'm glad that it's coming to a head at the same time, because then you pass one override and you try to drive it home with one good size override and have a budget reset in all areas. That way you're not doing it stepwise. I feel bad for Rutland this year, where they just did it last year, and now they're looking at already abutting their levy limit. And you know, I know Holden and Sterling are in position this year where you know, they're going to butt up against it this year. What happens next year? You know, if they're going to be looking at another big increase next year, that's probably the better position to be in, frankly, but not by a lot. So this year is our year. One of the questions that I had was around transportation. So we, as a district, of course, are a very large district, particularly land area wise, and in some ways the size of our district helps us with economy of scale. In other ways, it works against us, transportation being the major factor, as I think most people probably realize. The number of students that we have to transport essentially prices us out of most transportation companies, because they simply don't have the amount of buses in order to be able to do that. So understanding that Wachusett is one district, and you know, procurement, there's laws around procurement and how do you make that happen. Has there been any thought to ways to break that up so that maybe you're procuring by town instead of procuring as a district, to try to bring in more competition on the transportation piece? Just a thought. I don't know if it's even possible, frankly.
I don't either.
Yeah.
But I think it's you know, similar to what's been mentioned before. I think we have to consider all opportunities and see what we can do. Right now, we have this 3-year contract, but I think we have to continue to think about, well, maybe we have to look at how we go out to bid, because we only had one bidder.
Right.
And to your point, maybe we're limiting our options by doing so.
Right. So my bigger question is, what are you looking at for next year? And I know it's jumping ahead a little bit, but where we're passing an override this year,
right,
I don't want to end up in the same position that Rutland is in right now, where they're already looking at exhausting what they had for a buffer that should have gotten them through, you know, a few years. So I want to make sure that as we are looking at what numbers we're trying to pass for an override, that we are, you know, if you're looking at trying to do a correction over several years, that we're trying to account for that.
Yeah. These aren't the right words, but I'd say this year wasn't a correction. It was more a reckoning that was forced just because of the funding. And, you know, and I really do feel like we have to be prepared. And so I think the hold harmless really shocked us. And I think some of the work we're doing around population will give us a much better sense of terms of what the trends are, because that has its significant impact. I mean, that was 3 million swing.
Huge amount of money.
Yeah. If you ask me what I was hoping for in this budget, to be completely honest, is that we would have been eligible for more state aid. And with that, we would have built a budget that helped out with some foundational services. So when we looked at the technology and other things, and then we were hoping, we developed a strategic plan. And one of the things that I aspire to work with school committee to provide in the district is, right now, we have a couple of things that we desperately need to improve. One of them, it's in the realm of special education. We talked about special education earlier, and I think really we rephrase it as MTSS, multi-tiered system of support. We we need to develop our ability to intervene when kids need help and not wait until they're at a point when they're become eligible for special education or other things because the deficits that they're experiencing are so extreme. That doesn't mean that we don't need to continue to improve special education. I think we have to look at all of our programming and how we're providing services, and that is a big need for the district. And so one of the challenges in trying to do that work is right now at our elementary level, we have no positions that necessarily provide that support. If we have a school that's eligible for Title I, right, which is a federal grant program that is based on the economic status of the students in the school, we're able to have a single tutor in some of our elementary schools. And so that was work that we're hoping to identify what types of positions would be helpful. And could we possibly add those in our elementary schools, or in the case of Paxton, K-8 at Paxton Center School, because we don't have it. And I would say that that's an investment that's helpful long-term, because I think this is typical for a lot of school districts, in that we end up providing services that perhaps would not have been needed if we had intervened more appropriately at a younger age. And so that's something I'd like to, that we think we will advocate for next year. We still don't have, and that piece of it, the interventionists, whether it be reading specialists or whatever it is at the elementary level, most school districts in the state have that, and we don't. Something similar, I think most school districts have a health education program. We really don't. I mentioned a little bit earlier that we're still hoping to identify some efficiencies in terms of guidance staff. We're not, Dr. Kroll had done a presentation last year, we're not at the numbers that's recommended by any professional body. We're really not even close. And so those are some areas in particular that we're hopeful that we can address as we move forward in the budget. I wasn't kidding, and I'm serious about this. And, you know, I called it out in the presentation in terms of us looking within and looking at efficiencies. Like we do, we have to look at our staffing levels at all of our schools and where we are putting money, and making sure that if we have a position, that position has an appropriate caseload, that they're servicing a number of students. Much like we look at our class sizes and say that's too high, we also have to look at times and make sure that we're asking the question, is that class size too low? And do we need to redeploy that resource elsewhere? And so if I'm being honest, next year, our hope is through the strategic plan to identify additional positions to add to the budget. But my hope is that a lot of those costs will be defrayed by efficiencies that we're going to uncover in our own budget. But as the educational leader of this district, there are some things that we're not doing, and it's borne out in our data that we're not doing a good enough job with. And if you look at where we're failing students, it's our high needs population. And the high needs population is identified as English learners, children who come from a lower socioeconomic household, and special education students. And those kids have a significantly different experience in our district than our other students. And we've got to find a way to address that. And that isn't only borne out in the data in terms of achievement, it's actually borne out in the data of them attending school. And so those are some of the things that we're hoping to address as we move forward in the next budget cycle. I do think some of that is going to be addressed in positions, human capital. But I would also say we're hoping, and the reason why it's not in this year's budget isn't because we took it out of this budget. We had always planned on doing it next fiscal year. And the reason why is because we wanted to have established deficiencies and to understand, like, okay, we don't need 12 positions, we need 6. You know what I mean? Or whatever it is. But that does make me nervous for next year. It makes me nervous when we have towns like Rutland that passed a override last year, and we can't keep on asking people to do this. Like I do take the piece of us being responsible town partners seriously, and I live here. I live in Holton, and I'm not going to tell you where. No, I'm in Holden, and I don't want our services to be cut, and people are making that up, and you know, and so that's hard, and I really do feel like we're in this this perfect storm where, and I said this to the town managers the other day, we had a meeting on Tuesday, and you know, the town, you're dealing with the same issues in terms of funding as we are. And so it's really hard to see the pathway forward. And then, you know, we're charged, school committee's charged, I'm charged with also trying to make things better for kids, making sure when we send kids off, they have what they need to do whatever they want to do in life. You know, that's what we want. You know, we feel like we have ways of getting there. Some of it we can do with minimal financial impact, but that is the impact. That's the one piece I'm continuing to look at. If I'm being truly honest, and I don't want to say this, but the truth is I do feel like we have to look at adding some key positions moving forward if we're really going to give the experience that we want for some of our kids. And I'm hoping again to do so in the most cost-effective way we could. And the plan is always trying to do it for next year and try to match it potentially if the towns were looking towards an override anyways, to try to partner with that and to try to make that a viable plan. The hard thing is we're in slightly different contexts financially in all of our towns at different times. But that would be the best answer I can give you in terms of what's on.
So I just want to say I really appreciate how intentional you're being with the planning process, because you know, really looking at everything and trying to make sure that you're only spending what you need to spend. Certainly a district of this size is going to have some operational inefficiencies that could probably be addressed, especially, you know, over the number of years that we've been looking at maybe not addressing that kind of an issue. So I really appreciate it. And I also wanted to thank Peter for attending. I'm sorry that you're maybe not getting some feedback that you'd like, but we appreciate you being here to listen.
Absolutely.
I'm Scott Renstrom. I'm a Paxton representative on the school committee. And before I was on the school committee, I was almost 20 years on the Paxton Finance Committee and the Select Board. So believe me, I understand where you're all coming from. And I won't talk long. I just want to say the elephant in the room here really is inflation has been running an average of about 6% over the last 3 years, right? So all of our costs are going up, the town costs and the district costs. So when we're stuck with the 2.5% each year, that puts you in a really difficult position. So I think what we're all seeing here, and I understand where everyone's coming from, is we're in the position we either need to cut services, either on the school side or the town side, or increase revenue. That's the only two options that we have. So, you know, each town has to think carefully about where they stand there, but there's really no other options besides those two, because I know there's not a lot of fat in any of the town budgets. There's also, I trust very much that our administration is now on top of what we're spending. There's not a lot of fat in this budget either. So that's where we are. We either increase revenues or we have to cut services substantially. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Leah Gustafson. I am the one of the Holden representatives on the school committee. And I first want to thank you all for coming again. I thank the superintendent and Director Grise for all of your hard work in bringing this to us in such detail. A couple quick notes. I will save most of it for other discussions, but I think the hold harmless is definitely a huge challenge. So thank you, Senator Durant, for being here. It's really beyond our control, really. I mean, some of it is, but the way it is funded and drastically different than those districts that are not in hold harmless, and the fact that fundamentally 2/3 of the funding for the state is going to the 1/3 that needs it the least, because they are getting an increase in students and in their aid. And the other 2/3, I think the fact that 2/3 of the state is in hold harmless this year approximately, but only getting 1/3 of the school education revenue because of the way the formula is written, indicates there is a huge problem there. So I'm hoping on the state level that can be addressed, because that is really harming us. The intent, I know, is that, you know, you won't lose any funds, and that's a positive thing. But when that gap is filled by the state, the other piece is that the town contributions are also affected, because our total foundation budget doesn't decrease. And so I have seen graphics in the past that explain this very well. but during COVID, we were in home harmless for a couple of years. And that's one thing that we learned is that even though the state fills in the gap with in Chapter 70 funds theoretically, the total budget is not allowed to decrease, which also impacts the town contribution. It means that the town contributions actually also go up by more than typical. And so it's something that is actually harming us in districts that only go up and down by a few students each year. So I'm really hoping you can take a look at that, whether it's on the state level or for us in particular. We are the 25th largest district in the entire state, at least by last year's numbers. And the state does not see us that way, because when you look at our foundation budget and the wealth of our towns and all those calculations, it shows up very differently than the urban areas, which is where most of the other 24 of those districts land. But we are the 25th biggest district in the state total. And that, I think, is something that also is missed. It impacts how far our dollars go. The other thing is I do want to indicate, I really appreciate the comments from the towns and support of the towns. As a Holden representative, I do want to mention, I know that Chris, you'd mentioned it's about $1 million difference between what we're hoping for and where we are. The minimum local contribution from the state is almost $1 million increase this year before we touch our budget. So even if we were level funded this year in our local budget, it would still have that difference. And so, I mean, I think that says a lot for what the district is being able to do, but I think that's also something that our residents in particular need to understand, that $1 million is almost entirely allocated by the state funding formula that we have zero control over. And that is also the only piece of our budget that we know relatively early on. Someone had mentioned the timeline. Part of what makes this all very challenging, and we know this for years, is that we don't get any inkling of our state funding numbers. We'd love to get them in October, but we don't get them until January when the governor's budget comes out. That is the very first inkling of what we will be getting from the state. And so it makes it very difficult to have these discussions on the timeline we're on. The urban districts, the city districts that are not regionals, they have until June to figure out their budget technically. I mean, their timeline's a little bit different, but because of how our town meetings work and all of that, we are kind of on a compressed timeline, which again is out of our control. And so I think we are moving in a much better direction. I appreciate all of the dialogue we're having, but I do think, unfortunately, some of these factors that are coming together, most of them are beyond our control right now. And that is, at least to me as a school committee member and a resident of Holden, incredibly frustrating. This is my 6th year on the school committee. I think we're moving in a positive direction, but we need to find a way to work on these state issues that are impacting us that we have zero control over. So I appreciate all of your conversations and look forward to continuing them.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
You want to check the online?
Yes. Thanks. Barry, do we have?
No hands raised, you could ask.
No. Is there anyone? I don't think you hear me. Is there anyone online who has any questions or comments? No. Okay, I don't. If anyone puts their hand up, let me know. I appreciate everyone's comments. Just to sort of add on, while Peter Durant is nice enough to be here, that one of the step functions in the funding this year that I think is also challenging is the decrease in the inflation rate that's being used to calculate the expenses. So the highest that the state will go is 4.5%. We know the past couple of years it was really closer to 6%, but it was maxed out at 4.5%. And then this year it's at 1%, which is quite a jump. It's not like a nice, gentle letdown. My husband has a saying, step functions are bad. It feels very step functiony. So if there's any way when looking at the budget to see if that inflation rate can be adjusted, off the bat that would help our numbers a little bit. I can't calculate out exactly how it would help our numbers, but it would help our numbers and all the other towns' numbers. And I'm sure it was done in order to try to bring the inflation rate somewhere to be more reasonable, and because the state also only has so much money to give around, because changing that rate would change the money to all the school districts. But that was a huge impact. So if there's any way to take a look at that, we would appreciate it. And I think everyone else has pretty much talked about everything else so far. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments to go around the room? No? Okay. Jim, did you have any, and Michelle, did you have any final comments or anything you would like to add?
Thank you, everyone. We hear you. I hear you. And we're going to continue to try to work and improve this process and bring the additional detail that you requested to your towns. And just want to personally thank both school committee and also Michelle, the district staff, who helped us put this information together. And things are going to get better here. And we're going to get better in terms of financing, and we're going to get better in terms of student experience. But it's a lot of work, and as everyone has noted, there's a lot of issues for us to continue to address. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. At this time, I would accept a motion to adjourn. Roll call vote. Actually, we don't need a roll call vote. Everyone in school committee. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming. Have a great night.